Hey,
I made it.
how's it going?
It's going good. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. So today, our talk is, I guess we're looking at like a post-school world, what teaching would be
Hmm.
um, in that kind of a world. Um, I guess let's start with like what kind of brought you toward self-directed education?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. This is not my dog. This is a neighborhood dog. Um, and he's very excited. Um, oh man, that's a big question. How did I get to self-directed education? Well, I guess firstly, I guess for the people who don't know me that might be joining, I was an early years educator in international schools for about 8 years. And I was lucky to have a lot of autonomy, like to explore different things. So it started off like with Reggio Emilia, and that was like my first year of teaching. I learned about Reggio and was able to like look into just like the idea of respectful pedagogy and like uplifting young people's voices through Reggio. And then I got to think about like movement and how the brain works, and I played around with that a lot. And then just gender and sexuality in the early years. And then I got to the idea of consent in terms of like sexuality education and teaching consent.
Mm,
And that's really what brought me more into the unschooling space and self-directed education, because I started to realize, like in my classroom, so much of the day was non-consensual.
yeah,
And the idea that there's just so much that going to school kind of opts you into, and you don't have a choice or the option to say no. And that's kind of, even as an educator, I joined, I think we talked about Lucy Atkinread has a really beautiful circle for unschoolers and self-directed education people. And even as a teacher, I was brought into that space and really welcomed. And it was like, oh, I found my people. And so I've kind of never looked back since that.
that's so cool. I feel like I think we have a lot of similarities in our backgrounds. Um, and I think one thing that's different between us is that I kind of hit upon unschooling first, almost randomly, and then got into more of like the humanistic side of it, as well as social justice, um, and like conscious parenting um, after the fact. But it's all connected, right?
Mm.
Yeah. The things that we do have in common, we've both lived and taught in Asian countries. I think that's pretty cool that we can say that. Um, we're both
Yeah.
certified elementary teachers. Um, we're both kind of we're definitely into youth rights. Maybe mix in a little bit of the anarchism, um, right, for spite. And then just I think realizing that school does more harm than good. Would that be
Mm.
fair to say?
Yeah, I think for sure that would be fair to say. And I guess also just being educators, obviously everybody who has gone to school has experienced school as a kid. If you're a parent and you have kids that go to school, you've experienced that way. But I also feel when you're an educator, you get kind of this inside experience, a different inside experience that I think is hard to reckon with a lot of times, having that like that extra perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, it does add another layer on that. You kind of see like a lot more behind the scenes, um, a little bit more of the grittiness and whatnot. Not the
Yeah.
power that parents are supposed to be seeing.
Yeah, and I like that you made the connection just in terms of conscious parenting too, because when I think about people who have made their other people who have made their way to as parents, like some of it is learning about how to parent consciously and respectfully. And then you make that connection with school and you're like, wait, I'm treating my kids a certain way. And then I'm sending them to this space where the adults are not treating them that same way. And so how do you justify that? Um, so just thinking of the different paths people take to get to self-directed education as parents, I think for a lot it starts with recognizing the idea of conscious parenting and respectful parenting.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. When I when I started my practicum for school, I definitely had some friction with inside myself, and I wasn't so connected to like my intuition, you know, and I wasn't so connected to like myself at that point to realize like, what that was. Um, but it definitely was how everything that I learned in like my educational master's degree was not happening in the classroom. And I don't know, I just felt like kids were being hurt, you know, like animals, and constantly denied in so many different ways that it hurt. It really hurt. And I was like, wow, teaching is not for me. And so wrong thinking that I would be here. Um, but that's not necessarily true because I am kind of a teacher now and I do a bunch of different teaching, like just a little bit. It's not school.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess let's kind of get to the question, like what might a post-school world look like? And I understand, right, that this is a really ambitious question, and we are not by any means authorities on this subject. We're just, you know, kind of really interesting topic, like we're musing here. So just putting that out there. What are your thoughts?
I think that's the other thing we have in common. Like our conversations are like really thinking, our stream of consciousness is like really coming out loud. And I think the times we've talked before, we've like gone in circles and gone this way and that
Yeah.
way. So yeah, it's really just like a reflective practice to talk about these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if I can just mention one thing or maybe two things before we go into the question, I think one, you know, I'm not in the US, but I am from the US. And I do want to mention that, like, teachers right now, today, after what has happened the past couple of days in the US in terms of school violence, you know, and talking about the harm and the unsafety of school,
Mm-hmm.
I just recognize that there's a lot of educators going to school right now who are at school at this moment, if you're in Asia. Um, who are like making space for humanity even within this system that's not humanistic. And I think it's super important before we even talk about a world without school to just think about the people who are making space for humanity in that system, and the people who are going into the classroom yesterday and today and balancing their own emotions and holding space for so much energy, so many different emotions, so many different people and different needs. And so I really want to just recognize that, because it's commendable as well, right? We can talk about the harm of the system and the harm that even some teachers do, but I also want to recognize just the space holding and the humanity that some educators will bring into the space today.
I love that. And thank you for grounding me and the conversation. Yeah, I that's awesome. To think about it from that perspective, and especially with the current news that's on. And in no way we are kind of excited in talking about the whole world. Does it negate the actions of teachers and how they are actively working towards making a better system, reformation, being the best that they can be day in and day out, you know, with minimal reward for itself sometimes. Um, I think teachers do an awesome job, and I think there are some awesome teachers out there. And in my life, going back, I could point to like a good handful of teachers that I know inspired me, like deeply inspired me, and were different from the rest of the system. But oftentimes, what happens is the system kind of hammers those teachers down a bit. As sad as that is to say, um, so it's definitely nice to recognize they're still kind of standing out and doing, you know, being who they are.
Yeah, and I think it leads into this idea of a post-school world and thinking like you know, that idea that it's so hard to be in the system and, like you said, be disconnected from your intuition or what feels right for the humans in front of you. And so I hope too by the end of the conversation that maybe it's inspiring, you know, that some of the ideas we have, because we know that kids are not well in the system, we know that teachers are not well in the system. So although the idea of like post school might be might trigger defensiveness, or it might, you know, bring up big emotions, it's also this idea of like another way forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And also when we say post school, it's not saying, you know, it's with teachers, right? There's teachers still serve a role in kind of in our understanding, right?
Yeah,
Um,
that's what we want to get to, right? Like what does that role look like if you're a
yeah,
trained educator coming from a school and now we're saying, okay, there's no more school maybe, you know. So
right.
what do you do? And if I think most teachers who are either thinking about leaving the profession, I see it on Twitter all the time, teachers are like, okay, what do teachers do if they don't teach? You know, and I wonder if we can like figure out, one, how to disconnect ourselves from that idea of like I'm a teacher, and two, yeah, as a human, what skills can we contribute to communities, even if it's not within a school?
Yeah. There's a lot of big, um, and I think in our previous conversation, one thing that you that I really love is inquiry. Because I think, did you mention today inquiry?
Yeah.
Okay. I just think that that is so big in under where like students are coming. Um, we have to build something we're teaching them. We have to know where with their questions and inquiry as taught. Here we are back to like, you know, school and teaching, right? Um, it's allowing for, you know, a child all of their beginnings, right? All of where they currently are and all of the questions that they have of where they want to go. Instead of saying like, sit down, this is what you're learning for today. It's saying, where are you and where can we go with this? And what value can I add as a teacher to understanding and and the possibilities and resources.
Yeah, that idea of just like facilitating conversation, even, right? Like, I think it's valued in the adult world, but I think there's value to educators who can facilitate conversation with young people, because it can be different, you know? So, yeah, I love that idea of inquiry. And I think inquiry allows us as the adult to also give input, right? We're not the teacher, but we're just somebody out together with the young people wondering and sharing our own wonderings. Like so many times when I facilitated inquiry, I hear kids thinking, and I'm just like, that is like a great question. Like, you know, and then it piques my curiosity. Like, I have these questions and these questions. So I do feel like teachers or educators who understand how to facilitate, I'm going to be a jerk, like true inquiry.
Mhm.
Um, I think it can be a really powerful skill that they take into communities.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
love that Desiree said trying to redefine that was easier than I thought it would be when I left teaching. Um, yeah, beautiful. It's like when we have time and space, right? In the same way that kids have to de-school. I know for myself, it's only been a year since I've been out of school, but or teaching in a school. But yeah, I had to go through like the de-schooling process just as much. Like I called it like de-working. I don't want to work. I don't want to do anything, you know. And we talk about that process for kids, but what does that look like for teachers too? You know, when you're no longer in that structured system teaching.
yeah. And I think the point that's going to come up again in the conversation that I'm thinking about it is that we're expecting the adult post-school society to kind of cultivate, right? Cultivate this learning about school. But
Hmm.
it's the adults that are the ones that need to let go of school, right? Because
Right. Yeah.
they are the ones that have lived their whole lives by school and a society, um, that's tricky, right?
Which also brings me to a point. So I'm gonna like take us in circles, but it also brings up the point that I feel as a parent is like it doesn't matter if it's school or not school, right?
Hmm.
The adults in either space, just in community or in school, can hold or be harmful in both spaces depending on the amount of inner work they've done themselves. So it's not even saying that spaces outside of school will necessarily be less harmful. I think it's more about spaces where the adults have done enough reflection and inner work and de-school to hold safe spaces for young people.
Yeah. So that's kind of crazy, right? Because now we're talking about the fact that we need to have adults in a community that have made it to this point, and who decides what the inner what enough inner work is, and like we're now, we're certified, right?
Mm. Yeah, there's still a value judgment placed on certain skills or ways of being, I guess, right?
Yeah, so this is a paradox, right? Because we're trying to completely shed school, at least the harmful parts of school. And I think you and I would agree that one of the parts of school is the rigidity of education, because what it means is that only certified teachers are good enough to do teaching, while people that aren't certified necessarily aren't good enough, right? And which is why I run into a lot of homeschooling parents that just don't feel confident. They're like, okay, I'm teaching my first grader or I'm teaching my fourth grader, and I'm pretty confident with what's going on. But once we get to like sixth or seventh grade math, then I'm gonna have to start looking things up, and I'm not feeling confident anymore. Like, what do I do? Well, how do I transition then? You know?
I think that that goes really to that idea of like what is a teacher, and if we're redefining or getting rid of school, can we redefine and like get rid of the current definition of teacher too, right? And that idea of like YouTube is a teacher. You know, the earth is a teacher. And I think in the SCE world, the word teacher has like this negative connotation.
Yeah.
Um, but we are learning from things and others all around us all the time. And I think, is there a way to even maybe go back more, I don't want to say ancient, but just more, I don't know, original meanings of this, the idea of teaching and learning? I don't know.
It's funny. It really think about a couple of things. One, like the language that we have, the self-directed learning community is like almost anti-school in a way that doesn't necessarily need to be. Like when we say schoolish, I use that word too. Like it's a little school, or you're being a little cheap right now. You know what I mean? So there's like some negative connotations, but I think we're like the implications that are attached to the words that we're saying. We have to be careful about how we're using them. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, I guess part of it too is part of me wanting to have this conversation um, is this idea of like I am way more we said this before. I'm way more radical than I'm probably sounding right now in terms of how I view school and the idea of teachers. But I also like feel that because I believe that there has to be and there will be a new paradigm of education and like society. Like I think we're in this reckoning now.
Yeah.
Um, don't think that we will move forward if there's such tension still between the idea of school and not school. And so that's part of why I want to have this conversation and think about, like, instead of calling teachers the devil, you know, how can we all bring nuance to this and know that everybody's going to be in a post-school world? So what are the traits and the skills, and what are we contributing, all of us, you know? So just want to bring that up. That's part of why I want to have this conversation. Like, how can we move together? And it might not be fast and it's not easy, but how can we have these nuanced conversations?
Yeah, and I think when I think of transition, theoretically, like there's a stop in my mind and start right after that. But you know, that's not realistic. It's gonna be messy, right? And we said this before, political.
Yeah.
That's gonna be like the big holds down in my eye is the politics behind like what's okay and are we neglecting and why are why we're fixing something that isn't broken, right? And I think we can also talk about this transition of easing in, like what are other options, what are choices in the like in the middle.
Yeah, and we talked about that when I first heard it, I think from Izzy Damarai, who's a grown unschooler, and she talks about, like, right now education is a singular system, and we're not saying that get rid of it and then there's no system, but we're saying, like, we need a system that's multiple paths and that's accessible. And so I've been thinking about it as well, like, what if school actually didn't, you know, break or crumble? What if it stayed there, but it was about access to more options? And then eventually it would become old and decrepit because it's not meeting people's needs, right? Like, if there's available that are meeting people's needs, I think school would slowly become like a ghost town if we can work on accessibility of different ways of learning.
In a positive way too. I like that, and it makes me think of kind of how charter schools leach from school, like public schools, right? And man, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, because I can't necessarily say the charter school is doing it different, but allow a little, right?
If we think of charters, like, again, accessibility, right? Who's actually accessing them?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's where the homeschool kind of unschool world comes in, because it's like, and teachers are doing this already, right? So many teachers are leaving the profession and they're starting their own things, or they're finding different places. So I feel like it's almost happening. But how can we bring, like, some of the values of unschooling into that, like the deschooling, right? So they're not just leaving school and restarting school again,
Yeah.
but leaving school and really going through the deschooling process, so that what's popping up isn't just a bunch of little schools, but is something really humanistic.
I think two things come to mind there. And one is you have to move from standardized to customized. Okay. And then the second thing is, and this is like a pipe dream, maybe. Whole conversation might be. I don't know. Um, but the second thing is that what if parents like were able to use their money? So if they homeschool, instead of giving their tax to the school district, they got that money back. You know, and that's not a wild or radical idea, because it's already going to the school whether they're there or not. So it's supporting something that they're not supporting, even though that they have kids learning. So,
Well, it's interesting too, because we're thinking and talking right now, I think, really US based, right? So
Okay.
in America, homeschooling at the moment is legal. And so I think this brings in the politics
Yeah.
of function of school. And right now, people are allowed to pop out and leave. But if I think about Germany, for example, I've been talking with a family from Germany,
Hmm.
uh, and homeschooling isn't legal in Germany. And
Yeah.
even going on a holiday during school time is not legal. Like it has to have a purpose. And so it's interesting to think right now, like, yeah, teachers and kids can kind of leave and homeschool, unschool. There's requirements or not, different states.
Hmm.
But what happens when, when the big hand comes in and is like, well, this is stopping the actual purpose of what we want to happen at school. So now it's illegal, or now
Yeah.
people are facing bigger consequences.
I think so many completely layers of privilege in there. And like the first layer is like being able to take your kids out of school, still support your family, and that being okay. And then the second, like, just even be like allowed to homeschool. And I know in Japan, homeschooling is illegal. However, there's a growing number of children that just don't go anymore because it's like anxiety based, or you know I guess largely anxiety based, and they can't, like, kids can't, some certain kids can't find school anymore, so they're like quote unquote allowed to not be at school. But aside from that, homeschooling is, it's kind of, it's a weird dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, just on the same vein, just thinking about different countries, right? So I'm in Thailand,
Hmm.
which is interesting here. Homeschooling is like totally legal and not tightly regulated. Like the only regulation for Thai nationals is that they learn like Thai language and culture, no matter what they're doing outside of school. So that's interesting as well, the way they've kind of opened it up. And the only piece they're trying to control or keep a grasp on is like the language and the culture,
Hmm.
um, which is just interesting too, those choices, I guess. And how they feel, interesting how they would feel confident enough too to let it open up that way.
Yeah.
Mm.
Now I'm wondering what would happen if, let's say, we started either defunding school, working like slowly working towards school not being important, right? But what, and in that, I'm public school, but what if private schools start taking that? Because the general pop is still a largely school mindset in, we need school for our children to get ahead and have connections, et cetera, et cetera.
One thing where that caught me that you said is just this idea, and going back to this, the context of the states again, is public school. And one thing that I think triggers people when they hear like school abolition or abolishing school is that there won't be like public services for people.
Mm.
So as you're saying that, like I think one of the things that would get propped up if we're taking away public school but prop up other public services, like we've talked about, like other communal spaces that are
Yeah.
still accessible, or should be free and accessible, so that education is still a public service. It's not this privatized piece, so it makes it accessible. And I know that doesn't get totally to what you just said, but the word public popped in my mind. And I just, yeah, there's other public spaces that can house learning.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking about, I completely lost my train of thought. uh, yeah, so I guess what I was saying was the public school going, slowly down, whereas the private school slowly becoming um, more popular or more financed, or and I feel like that would be like definitely, a sign of classism, um, in one respect, but also like, the opposite of what we're shooting for. Um, because instead, there's a current debate that's going on, and the debate is like, should we get rid of school? That doesn't mean let's get rid of all school. It means let's get rid of public school and let's allow private school to, because the free market is self-correcting, etc. Um, what are your thoughts on that?
So just to clarify, you're asking the debate of getting rid of public school and privatizing education, basically,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah, my thoughts are that I guess that's exactly what I don't want to be heard when I talk about this. Is
yeah, yeah. I guess that's why I wanted to make that decision.
privatize everything. I'm saying get rid of public school as we know it and I think somebody in the chat just said, yes, learning would still be funded. So
Mm-hmm.
separating school from education and separating school from the idea of learning. So if we had public education and public learning, it doesn't have to be privatized. There has to be funding. But again, I mean, same with defunding the police, right? Let's put that money into services that actually meet humans.
Yeah, and I guess trying to list. We can talk bad about school, but let's list the things that are beneficial about schools. You know?
Mm.
And I think this is definitely not a definitive list, but the ones that come to mind are, um, just at the bare minimum, that meals, sometimes a safer place than home for certain people. Um, what else is, just having a community,
Yeah.
right? And a community of people that have, that have experience in the world.
I think this is where it's super contextual, because a lot of those issues are really unique to the US. The way the school system
Yes.
holds every other social system is one, unrealistic, and two, part of why that shit is failing. So,
Yeah.
like, if I think of Thailand, meals, school is not the primary meal provider, even though we're in a country where maybe the wealth or the level of wealth per se is a lot lower, and maybe there are more people here technically in poverty. They are not relying on schools to be the only place their kids can get fed.
Mm-hmm.
Safer than home. I can't speak to that per se in Thailand, but a community of people. So my husband is from Myanmar, and he thinks the U.S. is really boring. And at first, I didn't get it, and I was like, "What? America? Like, I love California, right?" And then I started to realize, after living in Southeast Asia for almost 10 years, one of the reasons he thinks the U.S. is boring is nobody's outside. And it's so true. The culture in the U.S. is like, you get in the car and you go somewhere and then you go inside, or you're home and your home contains everything. Whereas in Southeast Asia, if you talk about community and community of people, I'm getting this comment about Canada. Yeah. So if you think about community and kids just being in community, in Southeast Asia, everybody's outside. The community is outside. So
Mm-hmm.
if school, you're actually more in this like structured box, but the moment you go outside, you're in community. And I think that's really different than the context of the US. So saying that just to say, I guess, that this idea of relying on food and safe care and shelter from school is super contextual.
I and it's beautiful in that way, and I have experienced culture in that way. And I think a lot of like, in my experience, a lot of Pacific cultures are that way, in that they're very what's the word? it's just very open, very supportive of other people.
Mm.
Oh, hospitality. I think that's what I was going for.
Yeah.
And compared to the U.S., like, I don't know, it's just the US is not enough, and it's so easy for people to be like, even from we're saying what your husband said, boring here. So easy for people to not know what other possibilities are, to easily jump. Like, what do you mean? What's wrong with us? We're like the best country in the world. Um, yeah, I love that you're again like consistently grounding me like the global space. It's kind
Mm.
of
But it's important to think of the context of the states, because at the same time, because I think that's what makes part of school, or the expectations of school, problematic.
mm. And that's where a lot of school from at this point, right? Talk
Mm.
about right, like you've worked at international schools, and they are large for the West, right? So, what's your experience in international schools?
I guess I have to start by saying that I feel that international schools are like modern day colonization. So I have to just start there. And but my experience in terms of like the learning that allowed to happen, um, has been really beautiful. Like I've been given a lot of autonomy in these spaces, and so I've been able to give kids a lot of autonomy. And I've been able to, you know, I've been able to have a consent based classroom to a really large extent, even within a school and even within a classroom. So, um, my experience has been good. However, what I have realized is that school always has its like bottom line base purpose. So no matter how free I am or how much I've de-schooled, there's still, like, especially in international schools, the money. There's parents who have become successful in the way of money and wealth. So to get them on board for a different type of learning, although they might want it and understand it, they've been successful in the system. So they don't want the system to change for their kids. And by success, I mean their view money. So they
Mhm.
don't want the system to change because they want their kids to have the same success that they have. Um, so
It's it sounds a lot like white men,
yes,
right?
yes, like it works for me. This is a good system, and anybody connects to me, I want to stay in that system, have the same success and the same wealth that I've had.
Like the white rich that they are gonna keep in place no matter how much that's hurting other people. Keep that power. Yeah. Um, and that does sound a lot like colonization. I think that's a term that you can't use lightly, right? Like you gotta be pretty throwing out like colonization. Um, and I agree with you. Think back to the beginning of school with the Prussian, like the Prussian, how that was brought to the U.S. because like, only by the rich people that live. They were the ones that put it here. They were the ones that helped make lawmakers make the decision that way. Um, and it's so weird that it's still playing out in international schools that it's like, oh, cool. So now let's take what we have and we're going to transplant it, bam, right in another country. And isn't that going to work perfect for their culture? And like newsflash doesn't. And newsflash, it's in a couple different ways as well.
Yeah, it manifests in so many ways. And I'm going to divest a little bit and go back to the States if I can, just follow my stream of consciousness. And because my mom is watching. And I think the way this manifests in the States is still about colonization and the tools that colonizers use, which is one of them is assimilation. Um, and the reason I bring my mom into this, I'm like, my mom's watching, I want to talk about this, is because, you know, this is my personal reflection, but my mom's mom is from Mexico and my mom's dad is from Cuba. And they immigrated to the States in the 60s. And in that time, assimilation was pushed onto people really, really strongly. And it's a tool. So people who are immigrating to the States and a lot of the Latinx community, um, school is the way, right? School is the way to success. So not only have the white men said, here's this system that made me successful and it's going to make all these people successful, we're going to convince everybody else that it's going to make them successful as well. We're going to ask them to drop their culture. We're going to ask them to let go of their identities to join us in this
Yeah.
system. The closer they are to this system, the more likely they're going to be to succeed. And so if I think about just diversity as well in terms of self-directed spaces and unschooling and the Latinx community, and I know I'm going on a tangent, sorry, but I just want to say it functions the same way.
Yeah. I think that's a great example. And I think that by no means a lone example of that, right? Uh, in the way the West has used their power to make other cultures assimilate, that way it really the other, you know? It's like if you do it my way, then what you're doing is not right, or not okay, or we're not gonna, we're not gonna praise you for your effort, let you into our circle.
Yeah, and it's not rewarded within the system.
Yeah.
And if we just think about identity in that way too, if who we are, and this is not just in terms of like race and ethnicity and culture, but also just who we are as our being, right? Even people who are neurodivergent are not rewarded within this system. The amount of like guilt and shame that can come from an individual is so huge. And so, you know, in the beginning we were talking about maybe a post-school world is like a path towards well-being for everybody. I think that these same tools of, I guess I would say oppression, and I know that this, you know, I'm thinking of Akilah Richards' tagline of like, you can't keep using the same of oppression and expect to raise free people. But it's all so connected.
Yeah.
I'm a super rambler, sorry, but it's all connected.
All relevant. I just wanted to say, radical learnings, good things to say in the chat in terms of, the hidden and not so hidden international schools. And then also, let's see here.
I'm struggling to see the comment a little bit. Let's
And
see if
I relate to that so much. My Colombian grandmother and assimilated immediately when I arrived in the U.S. because that was the way they imagined it would achieve the American. I hear of this again and
right.
where that speak a different language, they'll refuse, their mother tongue to assimilate because then they, whether that's a choice, like a positive choice from the parents, or it's like a fear-based choice from, or
Yeah.
of.
I hope my mom doesn't mind me sharing. I don't think she does, but she didn't speak Spanish to me, and when Spanish was her first language. She didn't start learning English, I think, until she was about 5, if I'm correct. But she didn't teach me Spanish. I remember being little, like, talk to me in Spanish. And actually, just a couple of years ago, I had a heated conversation that was just fueled by emotion from me of like, why didn't you speak Spanish to me? And her response, now I have a lot of empathy for, and I'm getting teary-eyed, sorry, was just like, I struggled speaking English because she's a native Spanish speaker in America. And she just said, I didn't want you to struggle that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's coming from love, right? Totally.
And it's protection and like,
Yeah.
maybe even an understanding of the system that maybe I thought wasn't there.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe it in ways added to that, to you not realizing how much the system was there.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And
Um,
I guess language is also like privilege and power, right?
hmm
So in a way, it's like, yeah, it's just giving a leg up on the system.
Well, I mean, that is a part of this. And it also makes me of when I think of like BIPOC and how, currently, like, racism and anti-racism are, you know, occurring currently in America. And it makes me think so much of the whole bootstrap argument, like that people of color have to pull themselves up by the bootstraps to be equal, to get ahead. And it, from my understanding, like that is such a balance, and it's almost like kind of some language of the oppressor to, like, no, you just try harder or you're not trying hard enough, instead of talking about their self is what's holding you down. um
And then applying that to schools, right? So thinking about kids who are neurodivergent or just are bored, don't want to be there, and then blaming that on the individual.
yeah, yeah, so it's like, the first step is to realize school is helpful, right? That's how you get ahead, right?
Mm.
And then almost the next step to realize that, well, actually, the best way to get ahead is to at the very least decentralize lives as much as possible. You know what I mean? And I think there's like kind of a progression there, especially for underprivileged families, because if you try to, like, for the most part, if you try to tell an underprivileged family to school, there's a lot of hurdles that there's a lot of barriers you're gonna have to deal with to do that. And I feel like people like Damari Dickinson are doing like huge work to tackle that
Yeah.
type, and that's awesome. But it's big barriers, right?
Well, and it's like massive generational shifts too, right? So like, how can we keep the momentum going? Because only break, a certain amount of cycles in our lifetime. So this work goes beyond like our lifetime, right? And it's like, how can we show up for young people now so that they just have less of the wounds, and so that they can show up for young people in the future. And we'll always have wounds, it's, I don't think we can get rid of it, but how can we open it up?
Yeah, and I think one thing I heard a lot of, often, people of color talking about, like, connecting with their ancestors. You know,
Mm.
it didn't make sense to me until I've heard it enough times to be like, okay, generational, breaking generational cycles. And then hearing people talk about, because you're breaking the cycles doesn't mean you're honoring the family that came before. In fact, they were doing the best what they had, and
Right.
you are honoring them by doing the with what you have now. And that really connected to me, whereas before it was like kind of this airy note. I don't know.
Yeah, and I guess maybe to bring it like, woo, all the way back, kind of the original path of this conversation, how do we apply that to teachers too? Because I think as a trained educator, when you realize kids can learn in different ways, that you can trust kids, when you've seen it, and I think you posted about this yesterday, when you've seen it, you can't go back the other way. You have to keep going in this direction. It's it's not possible almost. And so that's why I'm like, how can we get educators into this space as well, and into this space not because it's we're right and they're wrong, but because educators are already talking about well-being of kids. They're already talking about their own well-being. They're already talking about how this system doesn't work. So it's like, let's chime into this other thing that has possibilities.
Yeah. And I think when we're about possibilities, we're all about, we've said community. We haven't said that community in networks, right? This idea that largely our society is organized in networks. And, when you go to your job, like, this, you're part of our family, but really that's like, it's fake, right? And it's not a community. And a community is like people care and want to be there, and it's right. So community is the about, but also struggling against like what we've been talking about, power, hierarchies, and the big one is capitalism. And that sounds radical, but I think the more that people like that apart, it's not that, and it almost that we've just like floated along on capitalism for so long, accepting that that's the only way, and there's
You froze for a second. Sorry, I was like trying to listen. I'm like, wait.
Yeah, no.
I heard floating along on capitalism.
Right. So just like we've been accepting capitalism for so long that we think that there's no other alternative, or that there's no other way. And the truth is that there isn't another way with the way the system is currently, right?
Right.
We got to break down a bit to get these. And I think that's going to be one of the mess transitions into a post-school world, is that you got to break down a little bit, right?
Yeah, and I think again, super contextual. If I think about the states, and like work culture in the states, because it has to be, I guess, the purpose of school is so much connected to parents working, right, and places for kids to be while parents work. And one thing, again, living abroad, and living in Southeast Asia, where I live on somebody's farm right now, right? And I'm in a community that's like really trying to divest from capitalism. And I'll tell you, it's hard. But one thing I learned from like my host country where I am is they really do know how to rest. And I know rest, NAB ministry and different people are like, rest is revolution, right? But like people in Southeast Asia are amazing. There's hammocks like in the back of trucks, in the back of tuk-tuks, right? And you'll see workers in the back of a truck on a hammock sleeping in the middle of the day. Or if you go out into the village in Myanmar, everybody wakes up really early to do their work before the sun comes out. But then they're sleeping for like 4 hours of the day, they're resting. And so it's super interesting, just culture of work and the value of rest in different places. Because in Southeast Asia, like these people, Southeast Asians work their ass off, but they rest as well. And they're outside and they're in community that's not connected to their work per se. It's connected to just like well-being.
So many that came out of there. And I'm almost just thinking, Jennifer, are we looking to just descend the West, right? Maybe, right? And I want to read some of these comments because I'm one's in here. Um, there's a propensity for someone to promote and want to continue proving toward their own success, although it may be circumstantial or school being part of that process. Yeah, to continue going. That was Liquid Sacks. Follow the same process because it's what they know. Yeah, and it's comfortable.
Yeah.
Ever learning. You want to say something on that?
Yeah. So, going back to it worked for me, so it's going to work for you.
Yeah.
And it might, but again, it's like, how do we have multiple paths that people can take to live and be successful? Because the whole world isn't going to value the same thing at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
how do we create systems that allow for like multitude and nuance and different value systems to exist, but still honor people's like safety? I don't know. It's a big question.
Yeah, and I think we're looking community based as well as family based,
Mm.
individual based, and our current system allows for that, right? Only in like little pockets again that gets stamped out, spread. Um, one thing that you said, it really makes me think of how when people say, I got hit as a kid, but
Right.
yeah,
And
yeah.
like, but are you actually fine?
Let's deeper conversation about.
Yeah,
Ev-
I feel like we could talk for hours about like all of these points that we hit on.
yeah. Ever Learning said yes. Also, my in-laws from Trinidad, St. Lucia. I'm quickly. Yeah, it's hard to hear. And Radical Learning said that included the pursuit of. My family spent so much in schools because they saw the progress and a way out of poverty struggle. Yeah, and like just even higher education in general. Um, my family was lightly up, and college was like, equal life there, not to be so at all. For many of them, and I feel that the school, the like that school feeds you that whole idea that it's an equalizer. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's Manish from Schooling the World documentary, but he also does amazing things in India with unschooling. There's a quote of him though that gets shared often about like school is actually creating the inequities, um, and school in the westernized mindset, right? Not learning, not education, but just like school. And but man, if you say that in the States, I feel like you would get a lot of shit.
Yeah, you get tarred and feathered. Um, I'm gonna read a couple more comments. Let's try kind of wrap final thoughts if we can.
Yeah. Yes, and read the comments. For some reason, I can't see them. I'm struggling, so please.
Radical Learning said, realizing that this they were fighting us all were just, if not more oppressive, some of the they left. That's yeah, that's pretty deep. Yes. Um, and then Radical post school post patriarchal world, decenter the yes. Yeah, so um I guess what we're thinking of is we have just to cover currently, at least in the US, the child care,
Mm,
um, you know, special education support, right? The things like me, if we can play for them, I'm not necessarily saying that those are not, then how can we start making school happen? Is it going to be inquiry Is it going to be, is it going to depend on each family and what they have? Are there going to be other small in a place? Like, can you see a scenario?
Yeah, you broke up a lot in there, but I think I got the gist of what you're asking. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with the internet, but do I see a scenario of what this looks like? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things, and again, I'm living in a place that's trying to do this, like sovereignty, right? Like food sovereignty, and not having to rely on governmental systems for again those things that it is really less contextual, that the only place to get a meal for some kids is school. And that's not to say that schools in Southeast Asia don't provide food. They totally do. It's more that if a kid didn't go to school, they would still be getting food. And that's maybe not the most nourishing meal, right? Maybe it's a bag of rice from the side of the street, which is amazing. But there's still access, right, to food. But being sovereign from the government in the area of that, and then again, being more communal, so communal care. I lived in China, and you never saw young kids with their parents. They were always with their grandparents. And they were always out in the street, even here too, at the shop. Like if we go to one of our favorite Thai shops, the two kids there are with their family, and we take care of them. They sit with us and they eat with us, and they're not our family. They're just in the community, you know? So what does communal care look like? And so I guess in terms of scenarios, I feel like it has to be flexible because the needs of everybody are different.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe there are families that want to take a more capitalistic route and still have those values. Like, is there a space for them too?
Yeah. I think that back to what we were saying, the least standardized we can become, um, customized we can do.
Right.
I think the least amount fear-based we can have and the amount of education, like that would be optimal.
Yeah. And then even just getting back to this idea of like, what is the teacher's role in that? I don't know. I think teachers can, if there would be like a really cool time to just de-school, which probably was like during the pandemic, we could have all just really de-schooled. But I'm thinking if there was this process that teachers could go through to honestly heal parts of themselves that are constantly holding space and making space for the needs of 20 to 30, sometimes even 40 humans in their care, honestly, I feel like that's necessary to then move forward. And maybe after some of that deschooling and just breathing, maybe some teachers would still say, I still believe this. I still believe I have to ingrain this in a kid's mind, or, you know, whatever it is, maybe. And then maybe there's a lane for them. And if somebody wants that, then it's there. And those who have healed and realized, like, I'm human and I want to provide a humanistic space, there's space for that too. You know, I don't know.
I like that. I like that it's not like a closed book in terms of what the possibility, that if teachers do go through the interview, they still side with like a sort of a school type scenario, that's okay too, maybe, right? And
I mean, I guess part of it is, and I think this is for me what I like self-directed education and unschooling on is consent. Because again, going back to the skill a teacher can provide, like breaking down a big concept explicitly, somebody who likes processes and systems and providing those protocols, like somebody might need that, somebody might want that. And so I think that some of those things can exist, but they hinge on consent, and
Yeah,
they hinge on intrinsically regulated motivation.
right. So you're not going to just force someone into the model you want, right? That's not going to work for an adult in the same way that it doesn't work for kids. And I think that's important that for um, we're allowed, you know, their own choices. Um, and you know, one thing thinking of that, you know, you're thinking that to do something, and I feel like after that point, and the teachers can be helping create the space and teaching other, you know, I feel like that could be roles too, right?
You broke up again. So
Oh,
teachers can be teaching other teachers. Is that what you said?
yeah, maybe they can be kind of the spearheaders, ones that
Mm,
are driving it with this is what I've learned, this is what from inner work, and this is the direction to go. Follow if
yeah.
you're interested.
I mean, I think that's something I want to try to do. I'm like trying to connect with educators, but I have to check my language, right? Because again, I'm talking about this really nuanced with you, but there's things I really believe that I'm trying to keep it nuanced though, right? Because not everybody's going to believe like me. So yeah, I want to connect with educators with the understanding of being an educator too, but also this experience of unschooling. Um, and I'm on Twitter a lot. Edu Twitter is kind of crazy. Um, but teachers don't want to learn from anybody who's like not in the classroom. Like if you haven't been in the classroom, I don't trust you to like actually know what's going on. Um, and I find that kind of problematic because it's like you can learn from anybody, right? Maybe we don't understand what you're up against per se, but and it's like the same with like cross industry professional development, right? Like I could go to professional development for a marketer or for, I don't know, a truck driver, different professions, and there might be something I can actually take away because it's like we're living in a world, so I don't remember how I got on that track other than to say, yes, even teachers, we can learn from everybody and everything. So why are we scared to learn from homeschoolers? Or why are we scared to learn from unschoolers? Those
Maybe,
kids are learning.
maybe it's talking the power dynamics in terms of like, you know, teachers feel safe to have even though they don't like it. And they feel comfortable even though it's not necessarily comfortable. And that to call out the system that they know it isn't feels like an attack on them, right? Even though they might be doing what they have, right?
Yeah, massively. I mean, I connect it again to like white fragility and this idea of like the first step in anti-racism is just like acknowledging that you could be upholding systems of oppression even unintentionally. And I feel like that's a really big first step for educators as well, that you could be perpetuating harm even with good intention.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Listen, we could talk all day for about this. Do you have any other wrap this up with?
Yeah, I think my closing argument. No, just kidding. I think my last thought is just I'm really passionate that like we have a way forward and I think it's together. And so I think there's fear in the way we interact, homeschoolers to teachers, teachers to homeschoolers. I think there's fear on both sides. And so I just want to say there is space for all of us because we're all in this world. And so like let's learn and like hear each other and move forward for the kids. right? Like for the young people, we've talked a lot about adults, but all of this is creating paths for the young people.
Yeah, and I think with like the polarization of the West happening, I think it makes sense to remind ourselves that we're more alike than different. Um, that connection can happen. Um,
Yeah.
Now, I want to thank you for this conversation. Thank you for grounding me in current events and the global like world that we live in. And it's been really fun.
Yes, I appreciate you so much. I know I'm such a rambler, but I appreciate that you always have such thoughtful, just connections and entry points to my ramblings. It's really great to connect with you.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome.